The NFL season is just a few weeks away, so today I want to talk about the top 5 contenders within the NFC. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the top 5 contenders within the NFC. Before I start the video, I want to talk about 2 honorable mentions, those teams being the LA Rams and the Atlanta Falcons. For the Los Angeles Rams, I think they're a very good team, but I do have a couple of question marks within this team. Number one, it's actually a very young roster, so we'll have to wait and see how those guys perform in year number 1/2 or 3. And I'm also just a little bit concerned about the injury history the past couple years with guys like Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford. If those 2 players can stay healthy, I do think this team is a legitimate threat within the NFC and probably could win a couple playoff games, if not make it all the way to the Super Bowl. As it goes for the Atlanta Falcons, I just think there's a little bit too much concerns with the health of Kirk Cousins. We're talking about an older quarterback who just had a torn Achilles or ruptured Achilles or something along those lines. So I think it's pretty reasonable for me to be a little bit pessimistic about that roster until I see them on the field. With that being said, I don't have a ton of question marks about the roster because I think the roster is really talented, but until I see it on the field, I can't put them in a list like this. Now, before I get in the video, if you guys enjoy daily NFL content, I think you guys will love my channel, so make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button if you go on to enjoy the video. But let's hop into the list. Coming in at number 5, we'll be discussing the Dallas Cowboys. Now, the Dallas Cowboys have been one of the better teams in the NFL the past couple years, despite the fact they haven't had much playoff success. The past 3 seasons, they've made it to the playoffs. A couple times have won the division and have been one of the more dominant teams within the NFC. But as we all know, they have a ton of issues when it comes down to the playoffs, and I kind of think it's going to be more of the same this upcoming season. Now, I'll make the case that this Dallas Cowboys roster is not as good as it was last year or even the year before that, but I think because this team has another year of continuity building upon what they did last year, I think they're going to be totally fine and be a really competent roster next year. The reason why I don't have the Dallas Cowboys in the honorable mention section with the likes of the Rams or the Falcons is that I just don't have as much questions about their roster and about their continuity as I do with the likes of the Rams and the Atlanta Falcons. Not to mention, within the division, Dallas has been extremely competitive with the Philadelphia Eagles, so I think it's more likely that Dallas wins their division than it is for a team like the LA Rams, or I guess the Atlanta Falcons will probably win their division, but it's the NFC South, who freaking cares. But I think there's a lot of things going for Dallas that I think a lot of people have just been kind of not talking about. There's been a lot of negative press about the Cowboys, which in my opinion is rightfully so, but at the end of the day, they still have, in my opinion, a top 10 quarterback, a fantastic defense, a lot of really good and talented players offensively, and I think as long as this team stays healthy, they're going to be a contender within the NFC, just not, in my opinion, a serious one. Coming in at number 4, we'll be discussing the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, when it comes down to just pure talent on a roster, I actually think the Philadelphia Eagles have an argument to be the most talented roster in the entire NFC. You look at this roster from head to toe, whether it's Jalen Hurts at quarterback, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, and Saquon Barkley as his weapons, to go along with arguably the best offensive line in the league and a defense that is much improved from last year. On paper, this Philadelphia Eagles team should be fantastic. And I'm not really here to negotiate with you guys whether or not the Philadelphia Eagles have a top 5 roster in the NFL, because I think it's pretty obvious that they have at least a top 10 pure roster, and I think they're going to easily be a pretty awesome team next year. But for me, my biggest concerns is within the coaching staff. I think of all the teams I'm going to be talking about in this video, the Philadelphia Eagles have by far the weakest coaching staff. In my opinion, the Dallas Cowboys would be second to them. I'm just not a big believer in their head coach, nor am I a big believer at all in Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio. Now, I will say this, again, I do think the roster is good enough to make it all the way to a championship. Hell, we saw them do so in 2022 with the same head coach and a couple different coordinators. But I think we have to give a lot of credit to Shane Steichen and Jonathan Gannon for the job they did on that team that year. And I think that last year you saw a lot of the ability for this team to get exposed because of their weak coaching staff. And I don't quite think that Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio are the answers to their problems. Yes, they're experienced guys who have been through a lot of NFL games and have been through the ups and downs of an NFL season, and I do think they'll be better than what they had last year. But for me, when it comes down to it, I just trust all the teams in front of them to have better coaching game plans and, in my opinion, to outcoach the Philadelphia Eagles. Because in my opinion, when you're talking about these top 5 teams, you're talking about rosters that aren't that far apart, if not they're actually very close and similar. And so to me, me, it comes down to whether or not the coaching staff is able to put together a game plan that could beat the other opposing teams. And I look at the 3 teams in front of the Philadelphia Eagles, at least on my personal list, and I look at all their head coaches and offensive minds, and I think they'll probably put together a game plan that could beat Philadelphia. Now, I want to give credit to Philadelphia for fixing their issues in a big way this offseason. They brought in some new linebackers, some new cornerbacks, 2 brand new coordinators, so we'll see if those guys are better than what I make them out to be. But again, they're ranked 4th on this list for a reason. I don't think they're better than the teams in front of them, but I would not be shocked at all if the Philadelphia Eagles were to represent the NFC in the Super Bowl. Coming in at number 3, we'll be discussing the Green Bay Packers. Now, the Philadelphia Eagles have a top 5 roster in the NFC, and I would make the argument that the Philadelphia Eagles have a better roster than the Green Bay Packers. But as I said in the last section, I believe in the Packers head coach and their offensive minds way more than I do with the Philadelphia Eagles. So in a hypothetical scenario where these two were to hypothetically meet in the playoffs, I would likely pick the Philadelphia Eagles to lose because I believe in what Matt LaFleur can do offensively against this Philadelphia Eagles defense. That's not to say that it couldn't go the other way and the Philadelphia Eagles could win just based off of pure talent, because that is definitely a real scenario here. But when we're talking about 2 teams with a bunch of extreme talents, it's really nitpicky and we're really just picking at which coaching staff is better than the other. I don't think it's a coincidence that Andy Reid has been the best head coach the past 5 years and the most successful head coach at the same time. And you look at all the teams that win championships, they typically have one of, if not the best head coach in the league. And I just don't believe that Philadelphia has that, whereas I do think Green Bay does. Sorry for kind of taking some time with the Philadelphia Eagles when discussing the Green Bay Packers, but I just kind of want to justify why I'm putting the Packers in front of Philadelphia, because I do think that is going to be a point of contention within the comment section. When it comes to Green Bay, though, I think their roster is uber talented from head to toe. They may lack a little bit of the star power that the Philadelphia Eagles have, especially within like the receiving core and some of the members on the defense, but I think from head to toe, this is a roster with not a bunch of weaknesses. Yes, they lack a true alpha #1 receiver, but I think they managed to make up for that by having really good depth and 3 players that all do a very specific thing very well. And I do think the offensive line isn't as good as a team like Philadelphia or arguably even Dallas, but I do think the offensive line will be better next year than what it was last year. And defensively speaking, you brought in a bunch of new secondary members and a couple new pieces along the defense, and I think those players will make some big impacts, mainly Xavier McKinney, who's going to hopefully create some turnovers for that defense. Again, I think Philadelphia and I would make the case that Dallas have better rosters, but I think there's a big reason as to why the Green Bay Packers were able to dominate the Cowboys in last year's playoffs, because they had a better coaching staff. The last thing I say about Green Bay is that I do expect Jordan Love to play like he did in the second half of last year, which, by the way, had he played the entirety of last year like he did the second half of last year, we're talking about a guy that probably would have won MVP. So Jordan Love MVP season coming up. I'm just kidding, that probably won't happen. Coming in at number 2, we're going to be discussing the 49ers, the team that represented the NFC last year in the Super Bowl, and the team that came just a couple plays short of winning it. Now, San Francisco to me is an uber talented team, and I don't think it really has to be talked about in that much detail. The 49ers are essentially the same team, if not a slightly better version of what they were last year, which they were pretty awesome last year. But I will say this, they were very tested in last year's playoffs, and arguably maybe shouldn't have come out of that playoff as clean as they did, because obviously they skipped round 1, and then heading into round 2, they had a really big boxing match against the likes of the Green Bay Packers, which I think are a better team. Packers, at least in my opinion, are a better team this year than they were last year, so that's a really tough matchup in the playoffs if they were to hypothetically go at it again. And then they had to come from behind against the Detroit Lions, which they also had to do so against the Green Bay Packers, before they would ultimately make it to the Super Bowl. And in my opinion, had Green Bay had a little bit more experience within that situation, they probably would have won that game, and I think that same principle also does go to the Detroit Lions. If it wasn't for a historic collapse late in that game, the Lions are heading to the Super Bowl, and I'll be honest with you, I think they would have gave the Chiefs a big time run for their money. Now, I will say this, again, I talked about some of the more negative stuff with the 49ers, but there's a lot of really good pieces on this team, and I would say that they're a better team this upcoming season if they keep Ayuk, which I think they will, than they were last year. But I think it does go without saying that the improvements from Philadelphia, Green Bay, and Detroit has made up a little bit of the room and cushion that the 49ers had on top of the NFC. However, coming in at number 1, and you can probably guess it just based off the teams that I have not listed, listed, it's going to be the Detroit Lions. Now, I'll be completely bluntly honest here, this is a complete projection in some ways for me, because as we've seen last year, the 49ers were the better team than Detroit because they obviously beat them in the playoffs. But as I mentioned earlier, if it wasn't for a complete collapse in that second half, the 49ers would have been on their way home, whereas the Detroit Lions would have been in the Super Bowl. But that's not what ended up happening. But I do think that that game last year is going to put a fire under those guys' ass, and they're going to play lights out next year. I know that Detroit had some struggles last year against some really good teams. They lost to Dallas, they lost to the Packers late in the season, they also lost to the Baltimore Ravens. But at the end of the day, they were able to put it together in the playoffs. They beat some really good teams there, and they just came up a couple plays short against the 49ers. And I think this upcoming season, with a much improved roster, especially defensively, they're in for a massive, I don't want to say breakout season, but breakout season. Because pure talent-wise, this is one of the better teams within the NFC. They have all pro players just scattered throughout this team, while also managing to be extremely young. Now that this team has a little bit of experience under their belt and a little bit more fire from under their ass because of what happened last year, I think you're going to see this team take that next step next year to being a better team, especially when it comes down to those big time matchups against really good teams. And I think when you have a guy like Jared Goff, who is experienced, has been to a Super Bowl, knows what it takes to get there, and knows how he can just manage the game properly to get to that point, I think this is a team that has the makeup of what could be the best team in the NFC. Now, this is just my list. It's probably going to be wrong. The Detroit Lions will probably not win the NFC, and it'll probably be a team that I did not even list in this video. But per usual, if you guys disagree or agree, let me know in the comment section below, and let me know your personal list if you guys do disagree, and I'll make sure to reply on your comments. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.